I will take the liberty to introduce her. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Fani Gargova, who received her PhD from University of Vienna in 2019 and is currently a research associate at the Leibniz Institute of European History in Mainz, Germany. She has previously held appointments at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, University of Vienna, and Harvard University. Her research interests include synagogue architecture and Jewish spaces, architectural Byzantinisms, medievalisms, and Orientalisms, as well as the historiography of art history. Her current research project is concerned with the role of sound and acoustics in synagogues and their impact on the religious experience, particularly in relation to gender, disability, and power dynamics. Fani Gargova's first monograph on the Central Synagogue of Sofia was published in 2024. And it's my pleasure to offer to Fani floor, and I'm happy to hear your talk, that you can introduce it. I didn't say what you're going to talk today about.
Well, thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you today and to present some preliminary thoughts, which are not entirely connected with my current project, but are on the periphery. And thank you for this kind introduction. I will share my screen. Just a second. Okay. Can you see my full
yes.
my presentation in full screen? Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Then I will dive right into it. The synagogue is generally understood to be the religious and social gathering place of a Jewish community. However, from a spatial perspective, synagogues are primarily designed to accommodate the specific needs of male congregants. The presence of women is considered secondary, depending on the century and the location of the synagogue. This raises the question of how we can interpret synagogues as both architectural structures and spatial environments from the perspective of women. Furthermore, how can we identify women as active agents of and within these spaces? For me, these questions have persisted since I wrote my dissertation on the Central Synagogue of Sofia. In my thesis and the final book, published last year, as you mentioned, I endeavored to deliberately incorporate women into my analysis of this monumental structure of the early 20th century and its context. I examined the socioeconomic status of women within the Jewish population of Sofia, along with the vocational training that was instituted to help young Jewish girls become economically independent. Additionally, I analyzed the based-in decisions that favored empowering women to escape abusive marriages, as were the adaptations made to the synagogue space to make it more welcoming to women. These adaptations included the removal of any barriers that might have obstructed the view between the ground floor and the women's gallery, the creation of a bright and welcoming open gallery space, the inclusion of women in the synagogue choir from its inception, which was a significant initiative in 1909, and the incorporation of more pragmatic elements, such as a heating system for the spacious main prayer room. Yet in no case were Jewish women the agents of the aforementioned changes, adaptations, or accommodations. They remained a nameless collective, one that was dependent on male agency. They had no say in the design or architecture of the synagogue. Women were instrumental in creating and shaping other spaces, including literary salons, various social and athletic clubs, and political movements. However, they did not play a role in the design or construction of religious buildings. This observation, derived from my thesis, has been repeatedly confirmed when examining a variety of other contexts. The participation and active involvement of women has recently become a focal point in most other areas of Jewish art history. And this slide offers a non-exhaustive selection of notable recent publications. However, within the domain of synagogue architecture, the agency of women remains a subject that has not been sufficiently addressed. The field remains predominantly male-centered, perpetuating a historical bias. There are notable exceptions that address the presence and place of women in synagogues. And an important recent example is the work of Vladimir Levin, who is fortunately here, on women's sections and galleries, which has prompted my further reflection on this subject. The objective of my lecture today, however, is not to examine women's sections or spaces designated for their presence, nor even, to a certain extent, women's actual presence in the synagogue. Instead, my focus is on the active participation of women in shaping, defining, and forming a constant part of a synagogue's architecture and space, including those areas from which women were traditionally excluded. In order to address the issue of writing from an apparent state of absence, from the non-existence of evidence for my inquiry, I have chosen to examine both aspects of my focus: the agency of women and the apparent clarity of the elements that make up the architecture of a synagogue. It is generally accepted that when referring to a synagogue or prayer room, these structures are defined as the physical spaces that facilitate religious rituals and worship practices, and which serve as the repositories for the Torah scrolls. Depending on the denomination, a synagogue could also be defined as a sacred space. It is noteworthy, however, that prior to 100 years ago, the main prayer hall was exclusively designated for male congregants. The specific form and appearance of a synagogue are of secondary importance. However, a clear emphasis is placed on the creation of an interior space that is separated from the non-ritual outer world through the solid construction of walls and roofs. Consequently, the field of Jewish architectural history has primarily concerned itself with the form and style of these solid constructions and their overall spatial typology. While rabbinical definitions of a synagogue, as well as post-1945 synagogues, might diverge in aspects from this minimal concept, within the chronological scope of my inquiry, spanning from the late 18th century to the 1930s, the history of the architecture of synagogues has been written in such a straightforward manner. This history encompasses solely the immovable spatial and stylistic components of this principal ritual space of a Jewish community. And given that this approach appears to serve to reinforce the prevailing male-centered narrative, in the context of the present lecture, I propose the concept of soft architecture as a means to reevaluate synagogue architecture. This concept is rooted in contemporary artistic and architectural practices that seek to transcend the perceived rigidity of modern and contemporary architecture in order to adapt to evolving human needs and activities. These practices draw extensively from vernacular architecture, as evidenced by traditional building forms and residential communities, with the objective of creating livable communal spaces. Consequently, these practices also call into question the dominance of solid building conventions. The emphasis is placed on plasticity, warmth, and the flexibility of the spatial volume. This is achieved through the use of textiles and other soft, non-solid materials, in conjunction with the deliberate exploitation of the spatial voids characteristic of airy spaces. Recent scholarship has also posited the notion of soft architecture as a means to reclaim the legacy of female architects of the 20th century who operated within unconventional materials and disciplines, thus diverging from the conventional architectural canon or the parameters established by the field's historical narrative. This focus aligns with the aforementioned re-evaluation of vernacular architecture, emphasizing the importance of acknowledging the contributions of these architects within the broader discourse of architectural history. Not coincidentally, many of these women preferred to work with textiles or other pliable, non-solid materials, or were altogether active in the field of interior design. The notion of soft architecture has also been inextricably linked to the increase of computation and digitization in the realm of human actions and interactions. The terminology used to denote the primary functional components of a device, hardware and software, serves to underscore the foundational nature of this concept. The special connection to the profession of architecture can be traced back to Nicholas Negroponte's seminal work, Soft Architecture Machine of 1975. This concept can be regarded as a metaphor for interfaces and the relationship between organic and structural elements, emphasizing the transient nature of human presence, movement, and even memory. In this interpretation, these elements actively contribute to the formation and expansion of spaces and structures. Finally, the notion of soft architecture has been integrated into the study of control mechanisms that predominantly target marginalized people. These mechanisms are characterized by the exercise of soft power through design. This approach therefore examines the commissioners and their political agenda as an integral part of the architectural design process. So in this presentation, I will use the concept of soft architecture as a methodological tool to interrogate existing approaches to sources, including archival material and built synagogue spaces, and the methodologies that have been employed to date to excavate a gendered history of synagogue architecture. To illustrate the proposed approach, my discussion will focus on two areas, each of which exemplifies a potential avenue for exploring the role of female agency in the context of synagogue spaces. The incorporation of concepts related to foundation, donation, patronage, funding, and benefactorship within the domain of art and architectural history experienced a period of significant growth and development since the 1980s, particularly in the context of ancient, medieval, and Byzantine monuments. A notable development during this period was this focus on founders and patrons, which served to rectify the predominantly male-centered historical and art historical discourse by revealing the significant role of women as agents and active participants in the context of numerous significant monuments and artifacts, thereby exercising so-called soft power. In the context of Jewish material culture, Bernadette Bruton's seminal 1982 work, Women Leaders in the Ancient Synagogue, remains a rare publication that attempts to situate women as agents within the synagogue by primarily examining the material evidence found in late antique synagogues. This type of systematic survey, though methodologically now outdated, is completely missing for the modern period. Despite the plethora of publications that address Jewish patrons in various social and religious contexts, the focus of these publications remain predominantly on male figures, and the slide once again offers a selection of some notable publications. When women do emerge as major benefactors, It remained almost exclusively in secular and, above all, avant-garde contexts. Consequently, this impression supports the prevailing notion that religion has traditionally been an exclusively male domain. In order to counter this narrative, it is imperative to examine primary sources in order to uncover historical connections that have been previously overlooked. As will be shown, a thorough exploration of archival sources can reveal invaluable examples of women's soft power agency through patronage. A notable illustration of such a case can be found in the example of Burgel. Previously an independent town with a history dating back to the 8th century, Burgel was incorporated into the larger city of Offenbach am Main in 1908. Jewish presence in the area is documented as early as the 15th century. However, the formation of a substantial Jewish community is traditionally traced to the 17th century. Notably, a remnant of Burgel's Jewish community has exerted a somewhat intriguing influence on Israeli-American relations. A large and valuable Hanukkah menorah was presented to President Harry Truman in 1951 by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. This menorah, now known as the Truman Menorah, has been displayed on subsequent occasions by US presidents. In the context of this talk, the Truman Menorah merits consideration as it bears an inscription at its base that it attests to its donation in 1767 by a couple named Leiser and Brian Wimpfe. According to the translation of this inscription, based on the object files found in the Truman Library, it reads, quote, "This candelabra was contributed to the synagogue by the revered and princely man Rabbi Leiser Wimpfe with his wife Brian. May she have a long life to honor the name of God in the year 5527, unquote. So according to this inscription, Brian, the wife, is prominently featured as an equal contributor. Interestingly, historical records indicate that Burgel's synagogue at this time consisted of a single room in the town's gate tower, which was reportedly frequented by Jews from neighboring communities, including Offenbach, Mülheim, and Dietesheim. Given the constrained spatial conditions, it is challenging to imagine the presence of women at all. However, through the examination of significant and remarkable artifacts that played a central role in religious practices, it becomes evident that those women with the financial means were also able to inscribe their physical legacy within the confines of male-dominated spaces. In the case of Brian, it is possible to trace her active involvement in synagogue matters even further. This has been facilitated through the in-depth study of the account book of the Jewish community of Burgel, dating to the 1740s to 1810s, which is kept at the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem. The analysis of this account book has enabled the identification of the Wimpfe family as prominent figures within the local Jewish community. Moreover, the account book makes mention of several women from the local community by name, including Brian Wimpfe. This finding makes it possible to stop treating these women as an anonymous mass. In the year 1776, for instance, the account book documents expenditures for, quote, 2 floorboards in the shul by the house of the widow Brian, unquote. This indicates that by 1776, Brian had likely provided the land of for a temporary new synagogue, suggesting a possible alteration or expansion of the existing religious infrastructure. This suggests that she played an active role in facilitating the establishment of a synagogue space, which was particularly important during this period of municipal restrictions and may have been equal in importance to securing financial resources and overseeing the construction of a synagogue building. In a different context, another fascinating example is represented by the Turkish Temple of Vienna, the city's Sephardic synagogue. The predominant narrative concerning the inception and construction of this edifice aligns with the prevailing convention of accentuating the roles of the architect, community head, and the rabbi as its pivotal figures. It is known that the synagogue was designed by the Orientalist architect Hugo von Wiedenfeld and constructed between 1885 and 1887. The structure represented the zenith of a multi-year reform initiative that was spearheaded by the community's then head, Marcus Russo. The Viennese Sephardic community had historically occupied a distinctive and proud position within both Sephardi Ottoman and Ashkenazi Habsburg Jewry. They were permitted to settle in Vienna as subject of the Ottoman Sultan as early as the 18th century, in contrast to the Ashkenazi Jews, who were prohibited from entering the city and were not allowed to build their first large but hidden synagogue until the 1820s. From a religious standpoint, however, the Viennese Sephardic community upheld its traditional right, diverging considerably in its evolution from that of its Ashkenazi co-religionists, who embraced reform development in religious practice and synagogue architecture with the commissioning of their 1820s Stadttempel. Reform initiatives did not begin to gain traction within the Sephardic community until 1881, when the newly elected head of the community, Marcus Russo, initiated a comprehensive program to modernize the community and its religious practices with the aim of overcoming the community's perceived backwardness. One of the central actions of this plan was to hire a cantor and a choir master with the goal of establishing a synagogue choir. The cantor and the choir master were both Ashkenazi Jews, and their training was based on the Viennese minhag. They undertook the task of documenting traditional Sephardi melodies with the objective of modernizing and arranging them in a manner that would conform to the prevailing musical taste of the time. The process of transmitting Sephardi melodies into Western European musical notation, an unprecedented phenomenon within the Eastern Sephardi cultural sphere, had the additional effect of standardizing and controlling the music and thus the religious service within the synagogue. The measures had a resounding success, resonating with and thus fulfilling the objective of engaging the younger members of the community. Thus, in 1885, Rousseau proposed the construction of a new synagogue that would meet, quote, all requirements of the modern era, unquote, and complete the reform efforts. This new edifice was to be consistent with the liturgical modernization as evidenced by the placement of the bima at the eastern end and the establishment of order among the congregants through the seating of the latter in eastward-facing rows of pews. The Orientalist ornamental abundance of the synagogue was also in keeping with the stylistic tradition of Reform synagogues. The synagogue's innovations included the installation of an organ, a novel instrument for a Viennese synagogue. This organ marked a radical departure from Viennese Jewish musical convention. And consequently, the Sephardic community soon achieved a position of prominence also within Ashkenazi circles. The reputation of the synagogue choir is also said to have become renowned. The building of the Turkish temple therefore played a pivotal role in the modernization effort. However, the construction of this edifice was only made possible through the generous financial contributions of community members. Given their role as co-signatories of the building's cornerstone document, these individuals are identified by name. Among the approximately 50 named individuals, 10 were women, constituting a substantial 20%. A salient point of interest is that these women were not incorporated into the family names of their spouses, thereby creating ambiguity in determining the identity of the primary agents and controllers of legal and financial affairs. These women signed in their own name and their own right, thereby commanding over their own funds. This fact is particularly evident in the case of the 5 women members of the Russo family, among whom one can also identify Marcus Russo's wife, Jeanette. These are but 2 examples of the many instances that demonstrate that the historical Jewish religious communities were well aware of their female benefactors, were committed to keeping a record of their names, albeit primarily for legal purposes. It is imperative to acknowledge that the phenomenon under discussion exclusively pertains to women hailing from affluent backgrounds and belonging to the upper class. But despite this limitation, it is possible to conceptualize these women as agents of soft power within their respective religious communities. Their contributions were instrumental in the establishment and maintenance of synagogues, thereby facilitating the execution of ritual and worship practices that in all likelihood were inaccessible to them. The relationship between textiles and soft architecture is perhaps the most apparent. It is important to acknowledge the role of women as makers of textiles, a craft that has been traditionally and across different cultures associated with female labor. However, this fact remains largely understudied in the context of Jewish ritual objects. Textiles played a central role in women's patronage and labor activities, allowing them to permanently inscribe themselves in the synagogue space. Textiles were also ubiquitous in synagogues. They manifested in various forms, including carpets that covered the floors, mechitzot that physically separates women from men, and objects that came into intimate contact with the Torah, such as mantles, binders, and desk covers. Beyond their permanent use in synagogues, textiles played a significant role in ceremonial and celebratory events, as evidenced by their use in Sukkot and marriage canopies. From an architectural perspective, however, my focus today is on Torah ark curtains. These textiles, despite their mobility, are an integral part of the architectural composition of Torah arks. Torah ark curtains are imbued with symbolic significance, as such elements serve to separate the Holy of Holies from the rest of the holy place within the temple. Analogous to their function in the temple, ark curtains fulfill a specific and integral function in a synagogue space. Thus, I would argue that Torah ark curtains are a hitherto unrecognized integral element of synagogue architecture. Asserting that Torah ark curtains are an integral element of the architecture unveils a substantial corpus of evidence for female agency. They often bear inscriptions that refer to the donors or creators. Since the congregation generally faces the ark and thus the parochet, to worship, these inscriptions can also always be seen as a highly public and visible display of the donor's or baker's agency. An exemplary case is a Torah ark curtain that once belonged to the Turkish temple in Vienna, but is now lost. Its significance lies in the fact that it was originally incorporated into the design of the synagogue, thus emphasizing its intrinsic architectural symbiosis with the overall spatial composition of the synagogue. Having already sketched the history of the creation of the Turkish temple, following discussion will focus on its visual and spatial characteristics and the role of the parochet as a central focal point in the overall composition. The building presents itself as the epitome of the Orientalist style that at the height of its fashion. Its exterior and interior were replete with Alhambresque and other Orientalizing elements. Beyond its richness of color and form, the synagogue's most notable feature was its open octagonal space, which was inscribed into a square outer shell. The prayer room was dominated by an 8-sided main dome that spanned the entire width of the space. The eastern side of the space, which contained the Bima and Torah ark, was particularly elaborate, accentuated by an arched architectural element that framed the ark and occupied the entire width of the eastern wall. This frame was embellished with red and gray marble paneling and blind multifold arches in red, green, and gold, as well as gilded slender columns with Alhambresque capitals. The columns were surmounted by arches, each of which was adorned with a multitude of connected small multifoils, forming a shell-like fan with alternating fields of gold and red, embracing the ark. The Torah ark proper was situated on an elevated platform with a blue starlit half dome serving as a backdrop. It was divided into 2 zones. The lower zone, which has the cabinet for the Torah scrolls, framed the hanging parapet with 2 gray-blue elongated slender columns with gilded Alhambresque capitals on each side. The second zone, situated above a cornice and protruding slightly above the columns, featured a rectangular field at its center. Within this field were the tablets of the law framed by an oddly arched architectural element, itself framed by a multifoil arch. The central field was framed on both sides by 3 reddish Alhambresque columns with gilded capitals. A projecting gilded cornice delineated the upper border of the Torah ark, which was surmounted by a spherical dome decorated with gilded fish scales. The parochet exhibits a similar Oriental abundance. It has an elaborate composition of multiple Ottoman-style bands, each decorated with distinctive foliage motifs, which collectively frame a central panel. This central panel features a symbolic 3-part architectural motif reminiscent of late antique and medieval miniature representations of sacred buildings set against a background replete with a multitude of floral motifs. The base of the symbolic structure is supported by multifoil-shaped corbels. The structural element is subdivided into 3 sections by slender columns with capitals that recall the columns and capitals on the Torah ark and its framing architecture. The central section is constituted by a 3-sided niche with a darker background and a repetitive pattern. The central niche is surmounted by a cloistered semi-dome in the form of an elaborate ogee arch, bearing a striking resemblance to the ogee arch set into the center of the second zone of the Torah ark. A lamp recalling a Ner Tamed is suspended from the zenith of the arch. Intricate vases are positioned on both lateral edges of the symbolic structure, but of particular importance is the oval-shaped inscription from which rays of light emanate, which is the focal point of the central niche. This exhaustive description aimed to establish the Torah ark curtain as a pivotal element within the composition. Although the sole extant photograph here of the parochet is in black and white, the watercolor utilized for the purpose of illustrating the interior of the synagogue fortunately also documents the parochet in use within the synagogue. Accepting the veracity of this watercolor, it becomes evident how the formal vocabulary and color palette of bright red and gold, orange and blue of the parochet seamlessly integrate into the overall composition. Consequently, In the case of the Turkish temple, this detailed analysis of the Torah Ark curtain serves to substantiate the existing documentation, which attests to the fact that this curtain was designed by the architect, Hugo von Wiedenfeld, in conjunction with the construction of the synagogue. Of particular significance is the fact that this parochet was donated by the women of the Russo family for the inauguration of the Turkish temple. This act was recorded in the inscription in the center of the textile, and the inscription was clearly perceptible to all congregants present at the synagogue, a fact confirmed by the watercolor. Furthermore, the parochet in question bore the only known dedicatory inscription within the main prayer hall. Consequently, the women of the Russo family occupied a distinctive place within a space in which they were not intended to be present. As previously established, it is not uncommon for women to donate or create Torah Ark curtains. However, in the case of the Turkish temple, it appears that the precedent set by the women from the Russo family was emulated by other women from the Sephardic community, thereby establishing a tradition of female patronage and visibility on the Torah Ark. For instance, a woman named Rivka Finzi later also donated the parochet to the Turkish temple in her own name. A subsequent example will serve to reinforce the points made using the Turkish temple case. Moreover, this will further substantiate the assertion that if Torah Ark curtains are regarded as an integral component of the architecture, they can be utilized to provide insight into the appearance of destroyed synagogues for which no surviving imagery is available. In this example, we return to the Frankfurt area, specifically to the town of Sprendlingen, located about 12 kilometers south of Frankfurt. While there is documentation of individual Jews residing in Sprendlingen in the 16th century, a Jewish community was not established until the end of the 18th century. A synagogue was built in the 1830s, and that edifice underwent renovations and presumably extensions several times until it was destroyed in 1938. It is noteworthy that for a structure with a history spanning approximately 100 years, there is a lack of visual documentation. A single general bird's-eye view of the town offers the only discernible depiction of the southern facade of the building. Additionally, there exist private photographs that accidentally show elements of the synagogue's western main entrance. However, no images are available of the interior of the space, and it is not even possible to determine whether the bima was situated at its center of the prayer room or at its end, as eastern end. The only known interior feature of the building is the presence of a women's gallery located above the western vestibule. The sole surviving interior element of the Sprendlingen synagogue is a parochet that was rediscovered in 2019. This curtain was not part of the original interior of the synagogue. Instead, it was installed as part of a significant restoration of the building to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of the synagogue in 1931. Thus, the parochet is part of a new reinterpretation of the synagogue space by its congregation, notably during a period of significant financial loss following the stock market crash of 1929. The female members of the community played a pivotal role in this transformation by donating the parochet for the festive occasion, as the inscription at its center attests, thereby enabling the completion of the redesign of the synagogue. The parochet's dimensions, measuring approximately 2 meters by 1.15 meters, are indicative of a prayer room of modest proportions. The curtain's velvet surface features applique embellishments in gold, silver, and red, showcasing a traditional iconography of lions bearing the crown of the Torah, the menorah, and two banners bearing the Ten Commandments on either side of the inscription. On the basis of this appearance, it is reasonable to hypothesize that the congregation's aesthetic inclinations were relatively conservative. The redesign of the building for the 100-year anniversary is likely to have also reflected similar aesthetics. In any case, the female members of the congregation appear to have had sufficient means to commission a textile of fine craftsmanship. In fact, the parochet was not produced locally, but ordered from a specialized workshop in Kassel. A multitude of additional examples from synagogues across various geographical locations substantiate not only the commissioning and gifting of Torah art curtains by female donors, but also the role of women as the artists or artisans behind these artifacts. In some cases, even when their names are not inscribed, the apparent use of fabric from women's dresses, including their wedding gowns, betrays the gendered dimension of these textiles. In this presentation, I have employed the concept of soft architecture as a methodological instrument to examine prevailing approaches to synagogue architecture. This method enabled me to excavate a gendered history of synagogue spaces that places women at the center of the building's construction, design, and preservation. In the limited examples that I presented, women played a pivotal role in the financial sponsorship of new synagogue structures or in the realization of interior design concepts by contributing the focal element of the space, the parochet. In many cases, the names of the donors, artists, and craftswomen were readable in inscriptions and thus well visible to the entire congregation. With these donations, women partook in a space from which they were otherwise excluded. A close examination of the above examples and numerous others reveals a striking similarity among those female protagonists. The absence of surviving public records pertaining to these women, with the exception of their donations, is particularly noteworthy. Consequently, these women have been otherwise rendered invisible to scholarly research. Nevertheless, their acts of patronage have the potential to function as a means to address some of these historical blind spots. Finally, I use the concept of soft architecture to expand the definition of synagogue architecture to include acts of patronage and selected artifacts otherwise classified under the overarching category of Judaica. This approach facilitated the reinscription of women as agents into the history of synagogue architecture, but it also allows for a deeper understanding of the complex interrelationships between the structural and movable components of a building, emphasizing the frequent mutual dependence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fani, very much. It was a little bit different approach to presence of women in the architecture that you call soft architecture. I have one example that I will share with you soon, but first, if there are any questions. Comments, questions? Okay, so I will give you an example I was just thinking of while you were talking. It's actually based on the research relatively recent research of my own family that I started just this year. And I came across a woman originally from Jewish ghetto in Polna, in Moravia, not far from Prague. Her name was Barbara Weiss. It's from my mother's side. She was a businesswoman in 18th century, very successful. And I found that she, among other things, in her will, left the money to the local synagogue for Ner Tamid, that should be written in her memory. And here you go. You have a woman, you have her presence in a local synagogue, and also powerful enough financially to be able to leave such a memory for herself. So that's an example I was thinking of. I don't know if you came across similar cases.
Yeah. No, this is a wonderful example, and I think it just shows how important it is to go back to the sources, to the archives, and to actually look into instances like that, which you came across by looking into something different. Yeah. And it is often it happens very often that women bestow a certain amount to the synagogue for exactly this kind of memory keeping. So this is the other, I mean, because of lack of time, and I didn't want it to become to have too many points during this talk. But as I mentioned, this is why I think this concept of soft architecture is great, because it incorporates acts of remembrance into what architecture can be. Basically, the memory itself is already an act of building, let's put it this way, of construction, of or at least maintaining a space. So this is exactly what you just
but also in this case, I don't know if I didn't see it, maybe it exists, if there is any lamp, any Ner Tamid with some inscription, I don't know, I didn't come across, but the information is mainly from the text. So it just points to how much we need to read and, not just look at the artifacts, but to the accompanying archival material.
And if I may add one aspect, I think what you just also perfectly illustrated is the reintegration of those movable objects with the spaces. And I think for us, it's a given in many ways. We think, synagogue spaces together with all of these ritual objects, but in many ways, I feel like in our scholarship, we don't integrate them enough. So this, just to reinforce your point, just reintegrating those objects together with the space, because they are integral to the space being this religious and this ritual space that it's supposed to be. So yeah.
Ziva.
I'm interested in whether anyone has researched the signatures of women on art cloths and other types of cloths. I was thinking especially of Modigliani's, I believe, aunt or great aunt, who actually signed an art cloth that's in a Jewish museum that, can be looked at. At the bottom, it just says, that she did it. So has anybody gone into actually examining the signatures, or which can sometimes be maybe on the back or the front, and see to what extent this was a common thing or just, a Modigliani thing?
Well, I can leave the floor open to others. Just from my perspective, this is a wonderful example, and thank you for bringing it up. I think there is this one very beautiful example in the Jewish Museum in New York.
That's it.
Yeah, exactly. So to my knowledge, those it has not been looked at properly yet. I mean, there are other curtains that when that people have looked at, and specific makers, mostly though male ones. And yes, you're right. Very often it's on the back. And like in the example of the Spendlingen curtain that I presented, it is on the back, but it's a company, so it's difficult to identify who made it. But to my knowledge, and I will be very happy if there are any other people here who know more. There is no specific, people have not specifically looked into those cases or excavated like a corpus of women makers, women artists of textiles. Even though we know that they exist, there are so many examples. And just as the last thought, there are more known ones from the early modern period, I feel like, than from the period that I talked about. It's a very interesting shift. So this is also something that I feel like merits further consideration.
Thank you. It was a very interesting lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Sergey wants to say something.
Yes, first, I should say that I enjoyed the lecture very much because it has all the necessary attributes of architectural historical study. The name of those agents, the dates, their communal and other context, and the artistic and spatial description of the objects. I think it will find its place in the general architectural history, which is mostly concentrated on the names of architects and built solid, not so much soft elements. So congratulations with this achievement. But I would like to add something about another role of women in the liturgical space. I know from one memorial book from Volhynia that certain woman, some righteous Fredke, is taking care of Aron Kodesh in the wooden shoe, and she is known for renewing some removable elements and cleaning it, or putting some oil on it, or painting it. I think it's also very interesting participants of women in the men's ritual space when men are not there.
Yes.
If you need a quote, there is one. I've quoted this thing in my article on synagogue in Olika. I think it's very important. It's interwar Poland.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Actually, thank you for this addition, because it just reminds me that, yes, if we look into this kind of account books, it's very boring kind of archival material of the communities. We do see always money set aside for those women that usually perform this task, usually cleaning. Yes, very often from the ones that I've seen, they are not necessarily Jewish. So this is also an interesting thing, right? It's not just women participating in the ritual space when men are not present, but also non-Jewish women possibly participating. So this is thank you so much for this. It absolutely is an addition. It's a thing. It's a way to look, to even think further, and also to think about what about the space and the use of the space by different groups. So yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I have an open microphone here. So thank you very much, Fani, for your lecture. and I'm still looking for reading your book that, to the best of my knowledge, still have not reached our library. So I just recall a few more aspects and examples of women's participation or presence in synagogue space. First of all, there were parts of synagogues or entire synagogues devoted to the memory of women, not only couple, but women, starting with Worms synagogue and the women's synagogue in Worms, not section, but really women's synagogue, that was the name. And through Krakow Rema synagogue that was devoted to 3 women of the family. But I think, not but, and I think it's very interesting to consider, to ponder the role of the Torah Ark and synagogue space in folk magic and folk customs relating to birth giving and to opening and closing of the Torah Ark and the key of the Torah Ark and the candles devoted to the Torah Ark as an agent for protecting women and newborn children and laboring women and so on. So it's we have here a corpus of sources and another dimension of architecture and connection of architecture to everyday life and to women's life, first of all.
Absolutely. These are absolutely wonderful examples. I have not looked into the folk magic aspect, but this is absolutely absolutely on point. So I think thank you for that suggestion. On the sections, are devoted to the memory of women, why I've left this out to a certain extent is because on one hand they are very often chronologically beyond the scope of what that I'm looking at. It's like this is one thing, but also the question is who is responsible for making sure that this devotions, that this memory takes place. It's not the women themselves very often, or at least it's not unclear. It's very often the husband that make sure that. So I have not I've left this out because of this uncertainty. But yes, this is definitely one aspect that creates visibility and creates visibility of the name and of the memory. So it definitely belongs into this. So thank you so much. Absolutely. I wrote it down and I will look further into it.
Thank you for your lecture.
I was just thinking of something else that you can expand, and that's the painting. Like Maurizi Gottlieb's Yom Kippur was praying. He removed mechitza in order to show all different women standing on the section. And the other artist, also Polish, Mauricy Minkowski, has a number of paintings depicting women praying in a section, Zrat Nashim. So it seems that painters at that time, like mid-19th century, early 20th century, did have a need to present women differently than it was customary to see them in the architecture in a building.
Right. Absolutely.
Shalom.
Hi everyone. I just want to make 2 remarks. The first one is that we know that in antiquity, in the Talmudic period, there was no separation between men and women in the synagogue. So that's for one point. The other one is the Italian reality is missing here. In Italy, it's a tradition for women to embroider parochot and other items for the synagogue. We have the names of some women that we know that embroidered such parochot, especially from the Veneto, and even it's mentioned on their tombstones that she donated that parochet. Forget the first name, Luzzato. On her tombstone is mentioned that she donated the beautiful parochet to the synagogue, and also the binders. All the binders are made by women and given to the synagogue, and even more so, there is a special prayer that is recited on Shabbat before taking out the Torah. That is a blessing for the women who donate textiles to the synagogue. I mean, that's like part of Italian Jewish culture that cannot be forgotten. And also the Wimpel is done by women in Ashkenaz, but there it's not, the name is not mentioned. On the Italian Mapot, her name is mentioned, who is the woman who produced it and gave it to the synagogue. So it's touches, it's placed on the Torah, and it's part of the Torah for the next, let's say, all the services, and everybody knows that it was done by this particular woman.
Yeah. Honestly, it just reinforces what I was trying to say. And I would say that you just said everyone knew that this was donated by this woman. So there is an aspect of oral history that is present, so that the commemoration happened, the community knew. And in many ways we have the problem of not, relying on written sources and and these unfortunately often do not reflect this knowledge, this oral history knowledge. But in many ways, exactly as you said, it's women that created those textiles. In Italy, known, and in many other places also in this way. So the question is not whether, to me at least, I feel like we always subsume it. When we talk about textiles, we say, well, yeah, obviously it was women that made them. But in many ways, we don't reintegrate it with what it means within the whole, within the ritual space, within the synagogue itself. So this is what I'm trying to look at, because I absolutely agree with you. It is there, and if the evidence is there, I feel like probably most of you thought, well, obviously textiles made by women. So the question for me is, how do we reintegrate them into how we think about the built environment, about the architecture? Because in many ways, the architecture usually especially in the period that, again, modern period, I think the long 19th century, it's a little bit different than the early modern period. In many ways, those buildings usually, because they become more monumental, because we tend to look at the more impressive examples, it usually is about the structural element. So but I absolutely agree with you, and I would the Italian examples are very, very interesting. So just to add to what you just said.
I mean, they are so sophisticated that it's like the woman speaking, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And the ideas there are so prominent, and it shows that, there is someone thinking a lot about these issues and about the space of the synagogue and what people should see. So she's present in this way. I'm not sure, but I have to think about in light of what you said about this issue.
Yeah. Thank you.
Could I add something? Could I add some idea, some notion? It is not that architectural, but it refers to the synagogue as such. I mean the synagogues which are named after women. And these names belong to the women who sacrificed themselves for salvation of a synagogue from lying hands. For instance, the Golden Rose Synagogue, Gilden Rose Synagogue in in Lviv. It is a legend, but it has some support in her epitaph and some in the historical context. But this story, this motif is repeated in several synagogues, like story of Mirale of Brahilov, or a story of another woman in Lutsk. Actually, woman who is or related to the founder and not related works as a agent, salvages the synagogue as such, and it returns its use as a sacred building from secular, or even as a stable, or a church or chapel. And Chaya Bar Yitzhak has written on this motive. I think it's also important, though not that much related to the space of the synagogue.
Absolutely. My feeling, just because from all the great additions or thoughts that you've expressed, is what it just reinforces my impression that this is actually more of an interdisciplinary kind of thinking, right? We need people that think about historical ways of commemoration, and it's more of historical work. It's a work of conceptualizing communities and how they function and how the memory of women function, but also we also need like the spatial aspect and like the architectural, the material culture aspect. So those two things are kind of two sides which need to complement each other in this context. Thank you.
Shalom.
And I think another something that can help you also come to my mind now is the case of the Portuguese Jews. I mean, there the women, the new Christians, when there were no synagogues, they became the dominant leaders of the services and so on. And in our time, when these former Marranos, like in Belmonte, for example, they have now a synagogue, it's again the men that are dominant, and women stop their historical, can say, place of those who led the services in their houses, not in synagogues, for a period from 1500 until our time almost. Which is of great interest.
It is interesting, right? This once rituals are in the private sphere, of private sphere in the house, women take over, right? So there is this moment, and this is why I think usually in our field there has been a division between the synagogue, the public space, as the public community space, and then you have the household. And in the house, yes, of course, women are they're the ones in charge, and in many ways, and for a lot of rituals which are very integral to maintaining a Jewish family. And this is very interesting when they intersect, as you just expressed with the Portuguese example. It's absolutely
Okay. I think that if there are no any more questions or comments, we can conclude here and thank Fani once again very much for interesting lecture and perspective, and to all the discussion and that developed afterwards, to all the discussants. And Mar, you want to conclude?
Yes, thank you, Fani, for this remarkable lecture and really unique perspective. And we'll meet next week. Invitation will be sent soon. By then, thank you again, and we'll see you בבשורות טובות. שיהיו לנו השבוע. להתראות.
Goodbye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.